I'm Saul Davis, Executive Director of the Jewish Museum of Maryland. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's program presented as a partnership between the Jewish Museum of Maryland and Chizuk Emunah Congregation. Today's program, titled Making Commitments, The Path Forward, is the final in our series, Jews of Color, Jewish Institutions, and Jewish Community in the Age of Black Lives Matter. You can see recordings of the earlier presentations using the link provided in the chat. These recordings are a powerful record of an urgent conversation that this series has put forward. I just arrived here in Baltimore to begin working at the Jewish Museum a couple of months ago. And prior to arriving, I was working at the Jewish History Museum in Tucson, Arizona, where I was watching this series with many of my former colleagues. We were so deeply moved by the power and courage of its framing, and by the fearless speech and vulnerability of the presenters, and by the reckoning that it opened, by the repair that it seeks, and by the justice that it pursues. Culminating the series today with this session about the Not Free to Desist project is so fitting. I remember when a board member at the Jewish History Museum in Tucson emailed the Not Free to Desist letter to me when it was a Google Doc that was moving across the country last summer. It sparked important conversations, not only at the museum where I worked, but across the Jewish community in Tucson. 8 months later, the letter continues to catalyze conversations that carry the seeds of better futures, futures of abundance, and futures that contain multitudes. When you look at the list of organizational signers on the Not Free to Desist letter now, it's a glimpse into the Jewish American future. When you look at the list of individual signers, you can see that list grow and understand the letter's national reach. I want to say thank you to Lindsey and the whole Not Free to Desist team for putting specificity into the institutional Jewish community conversation about racial justice with the call to achieve a clear set of commitments. And as the letter frames it, placing a call into our community to reimagine our sacred covenant to one another and to our collective future. And with that, I would like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon. Dr. Andrew J. Miller received his PhD in Geography and Environmental Engineering from the Johns Hopkins University in 1998. He is currently a professor in Geography and Environmental Systems at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and also serves as the chair of the Chesapeake Bay Program's Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee. He is a past president of Chizuk Emunah Congregation. This afternoon, Dr. Miller will be interviewing Lindsey Newman. Lindsey Newman is the Director of Community Engagement at Lashon, an organization that advocates for the racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity of the Jewish community. She has over a decade of experience working to advance racial justice in the Jewish community and in the fields of women's rights advocacy and early childhood education. She participated in the 2016 SELA Leadership Cohort and was a 2018 Fellow of the Ruskay Institute for Jewish Professional Leadership and received her BS degree in Industrial and Labor Relations from Cornell University. Lindsey is a board member of NCJW San Francisco and a co-author of Not Free to Desist, an open letter challenging the Jewish community to reimagine its commitment to racial justice. And with that, Dr. Miller, I hand it over to you.
Thanks, Saul, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my privilege to participate in this conversation with Lindsey Newman today about a topic of vital importance to the Jewish community, not only here in Baltimore, but across the United States and beyond. This series was conceived in late spring and summer of 2020. The idea for the series, as well as a specific plan for the structure of the series, came from Abe Kronsberg, a member of Chizuk Emunah and a member of the board of the Jewish Museum of Maryland. We also could not have offered the series without the financial support of Abe and his wife, Robin Kaplan. Although there are Jews of color who have been speaking for years on the issues we tried to address in this series, it was really in 2020 that this became a truly national public conversation with the predominantly white mainstream Jewish community and institutions. This began before the events of last spring, but interest within a broad swath of the Jewish community increased dramatically with national attention to the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, among so many others, and with growing awareness on the part of many of us to what people of color, including Jews of color, have known all along. It's no accident that there have been so many webinars and some similar series offered by other Jewish institutions. It's also important to acknowledge something that Dr. Harriet Wims told me when we first started to talk about this series, and that was subsequently addressed in a couple of the sessions. She said, with her characteristic love and humor, that all of my Jewish friends have suddenly realized that I am Black. And second, that Jews of color are being inundated with well-meaning requests from white members of the Jewish community, both asking how they are doing and asking them to help educate the rest of us on issues that have gone unaddressed for so long, and that they are just really tired. We recognize that it is not the responsibility of Jews of color to educate the rest of the Jewish community now that we are finally asking these questions. And we are grateful to those who have chosen to engage in sessions like this one as part of the work that they do. There are certain historical moments when change becomes possible, and we believe this is one of them. But keeping the momentum alive before it dissipates is critically important. We knew when we started talking about this series that our goal was to sustain and focus that momentum toward making commitments for real change in our communities. When we read the letter Not Free to Desist that was published last June, we came to the conclusion that we needed to devote the last session of this series to discussing its implications for all of us moving forward. And I speak for all of us who organized this series, that we are so glad that Lindsey is here with us today to actually have that conversation. So with all that as preface, let's start our conversation. Lindsey, welcome, and thanks for speaking with us. I know that you've prepared a single-page summary of the commitments requested in the Not Free to Desist letter, and whenever you're ready, you can share your screen so that members of our audience who have not read it can see what the letter is about. Can you start by discussing the context of the specific time when the letter was written, what motivated the group of authors to publish this letter at that time, and how you arrived at the particular metrics of inclusion and representation that are part of the letter?
Thanks, Andy. And it is so great to be here with your community today. The Not Free to Desist letter was written in June of 2020. And essentially it was responding to a national moment. So this was a time where many in the national community was focusing on race and racial justice in a new way, many spurred on by the tragic murders of Black people in this country. And our letter was written by 3 Jews of color who had seen some of what the response in the Jewish community had been at that time. And so the 3 of us, so myself, my colleagues, Aaron Samuels and Rachel Sumek, had come together essentially in the wake of all of this after seeing what the Jewish community's response to the national moment of reckoning on racial justice, and feeling as though there was something missing in the response of the Jewish community. That, we saw that many of the statements coming out from Jewish organizations missed 2 opportunities. One was an opportunity to really authentically reflect the pain and support that those who are people of color and Black people specifically within the Jewish community really needed at that moment. So statements that would recognize the diversity that existed within the Jewish community, as well as statements that committed to concrete action moving forward. And so we actually, the genesis of the letter was a conversation between me and my colleagues, where we were getting together in the shadow of the Minneapolis City Council actually announcing their intention to defund their police department. I think that happened maybe on a Friday, and we had come together on a Sunday and we're discussing, and we were so inspired by that action, as well as some of the other national calls that were being submitted, in various industries across the nation around that time, of people coming together and really making asks and making, in some cases, demands of what change they wanted to see. And so we were inspired to think and dream up what is possible for the Jewish community in terms of a commitment to racial justice and to anti-racism. And we knew that in that moment that, there was a moment in our national history that people's capacity to focus on the issue of racial justice was greater than ever before. And so how could we really capitalize on that to create a paradigmatic shift of how we talk about racial justice in the Jewish community? And so in a similar way that in the national conversation about justice and policing, there had been a paradigm shift from defunding police being only talked about in the fringiest of activist communities to now being talked about as a in some ways more central policy recommendation, to even talk of abolishing police as a policy possibility that maybe had never been talked about. And so similarly in the Jewish community, what of our wildest dreams of what racial justice could look like, how would we express that? And so we did that by writing a letter that laid out some principles and commitments, and I can share my screen now to present those here, where we were really we were 3 Jews of color writing this and collaborating and talking to other Jews of color and white Jews, Jewish allies as well, and thinking about what might our Jewish covenant to racial justice look like. And so of these 7 pillars that we were asking people to commit to, the first was essentially saying Black Lives Matter, that was a commitment that we were not previous to June 2020. It wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now. And we thought that this expression of support was in some ways the bare minimum of what we would want to see. Second, that every Jewish organization should have a pillar of racial equity guiding their work. Next, that every Jewish organization should commit to anti-racist hiring and compensation practices. And next, that those organizations should also commit to anti-racist education and curriculum. So understanding that the way that we tell our own story of who we are as a people needs to recognize the racial diversity that exists both in our past and in our history, as well as the contemporary stories that exist within the Jewish people. Next, we were very focused on the investment of Jewish organizations into the leadership of Jews of color and people of color within any type of Jewish organization, as well as Jewish organizations making racial justice requirements for all grantees, so that any organization that was making resource commitments should expect that every grantee should have a commitment, a very specific commitment to racial equity. And lastly, we were thinking very strategically about what kind of accountability could be created in assessing where the Jewish community is going and how the Jewish community is really meeting these 6 other commitments that we were recommending. And so this letter was a culmination of all of that, and was laid out so that we were asking organizations to commit to achieving at least 3 of these pillars within a year, and hopefully would achieve all 7 within 3 years, so that we were really looking to specific action and specific outcomes.
Thank you. So the letter is written as a call to federations, to foundations, organizations, and initiatives. But the issues described are of concern both to those community organizations and also to synagogues. And synagogues have a somewhat different set of opportunities and constraints by comparison to some other Jewish institutions. Do you have thoughts about how a synagogue and its spiritual and lay leaders should approach the issues or commitments raised in the letter? And assuming that some of them are listening to us right now, where would you tell them to start?
Yeah, it's a great question. And our letter was, yes, very specific to maybe organizations that are giving out resources or making grants, and maybe more specifically or more easily the commitments that we described. Some organizations might find that they are most relatable to the way that they work. Synagogues, I think, absolutely can make some of these commitments, and at the same time their commitment and the ways that they might meet some of these pillars might look distinct. And I think that and from what we heard from some synagogue professionals and lay leaders was a need and an interest to think expansively about what specific commitments could look like for synagogues. So I think that is sort of in the works, and I think part of our goal with the Not Free to Desist movement is to also bring like-minded people together to start thinking and have public conversations about that. So I have a few thoughts that I'll share, but I also hope that that this is a communal project of coming up with what is a synagogue's commitment to racial justice and anti-racism. What could that look like? And I think that, in particular, synagogues should be looking at, what is the role of a synagogue? Synagogues are often, where Jews come together to have spiritual community, to have spiritual practice, to support people in the life cycles. And I think that for many synagogues, thinking about, are our communities open and welcoming to the broad array of Jews that exist in our communities? So are we able to, do people feel like they can come to synagogue spaces and bring every part of who they are, or are they being asked to leave a part of themselves at the door? And I think that part of that is, we can look and see, based on the numbers, if 20% of the Jewish community identifies as either people of color or non-Ashkenazi, is that reflected in our congregational spaces? And how might we close that gap, both in participation as well as in leadership? And I think part of the question is also not just how do we, welcome in those who might not be there already, but also how do we co-create an organization, or co-create from the start initiatives, programs that meet the vast needs of and the diverse needs of the diverse audience that exists within our community. And I think that in terms of looking at the racial and ethnic diversity in the Jewish community, there oftentimes in the past, many people might have said, oh, sure, maybe there's diversity, but that's not really my issue or my community's issue because we don't see Jews of color. And there are many synagogues that might have said that in the past. And I think that, that's sort of asking the wrong question, because we know that there are Jews of color out there, but there's a difference between the reality of the Jewish community and the reality of the mainstream institutional spaces. And so how do we think a little bit more expansively of how institutions can meet the needs of the individuals who actually exist within our community? And so for synagogues, that might look like thinking about engagement. That might look like thinking about how we define security and safety. Are we actually defining security and safety in a way that makes portions of our community feel comfortable, or in a way that makes everyone feel comfortable? So me as a Black woman walking into a synagogue, what I need to feel safe might look different than what you, Andy, need in order to feel safe. And how do we, bring everyone to the table when making those decisions, and when, meeting those communal needs?
Thanks. I'll just add, and this, that one of the prior sessions in this series had to do with Jewish community surveys, and it was pointed out to us as part of that conversation that many of the population studies have been done around the country fail to even ask questions about race. So when we say we don't know that Jews of color are there, it's partly perhaps because we haven't asked. And
Absolutely.
I think the idea of co-creation is a really exciting possibility. So thank you for that. Having said that, in some communities, we may have leaders who want to follow this path, but a significant fraction of the community that doesn't agree. How do we overcome this?
Yeah, I think a lot about that. And I think, and that's an inherent challenge of the work of any, societal change work. And I think a lot about what leadership is and how that is defined. And I really feel for my calling and for the calling of Not Free to Desist, I think it's crucially important to have leadership that has a bold vision for where our community can go and what the future can be. And I know that, having everyone make the same shift at the same time within a vast, large community might not be realistic, but I think that having people who are able to communicate that bold vision and have strategic, help with strategic priority setting, and some of that, the process, creating the process to get us there is important. And so I think in some ways, part of this change will be bold visionary leadership, bringing parts of the community along in some of the change, and setting standards, setting examples, creating models that can then be replicated other places. And that's how we're going to move a wide swath of the community forward. And so I think when thinking about how to fulfill that bold leadership, I think, knowing what role we can each play there. So some of us might, look at the privilege or the access that we have or the capital that we have, be that, financial resources or political resources, or relationships. How can you utilize that to move this conversation forward and to help make structural change? So if I am someone who, believes in this vision, how can I find others who also believe in this vision? How can I amplify the voices of others who believe in this vision? How can I help support those who are, creating structural change? And how can we each find our distinct role of what we can give and contribute to making this wider change?
Thank you. So before asking this next question, which builds on the last one, I think it's worth pointing out something important for the benefit of our audience. So I'm just going to take a minute to say this. We know that Jews have always sought out other Jews to form communities where they experience many of their strongest attachments, emotional, spiritual, familial, all the things that you were talking about synagogues. And within which they felt safe and knew that others understood their lives and what was important to them. And you talked about feeling safe. And this is a conversation we've had with a number of people. Last June, Rabbi Sandra Lawson published an article in the foreword that was just reprinted in January. And the title was, "I'm a Black rabbi. I've never been in a Jewish space where I wasn't questioned." So I'd like to stipulate this reality, as well as to acknowledge that we're now seeing a growing number of spaces where Jews of color can come together in community to meet those same needs that are important to every Jewish community, doing what every Jewish community throughout history has done. One organization created for this purpose, I'll just give a shout out to the Jews of Color Mishpacha Project, which was founded here by Dr. Harriet Wims within the last couple of months, which is really trying to build on this idea. So with that as preface, what if there are not many Jews of color who are either members of the community in question who are interested in working within that community? What strategies can an institution develop to change that situation? And should that be the goal? Or should the goal be first to work on how the community sees and understands itself? Or maybe about both? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I think it's a both and. I think the Jewish community as a whole needs to have a necessary consciousness shift of how we think of who we are. That racial diversity is inherent to who we are as a people, that it has always been true, and that, you know, those forces that are driving some of that diversity, so whether that be intermarriage, conversion, adoption, that those are things that have been part of our community since the Bible. That has always been part of who we are. And we have lived all over the world as long as Jews have lived anywhere, as long as we've been a diasporic people. And so that when we are thinking about centering diversity and equity, that actually this isn't a new challenge for the Jewish community. This is actually, there's values and wisdoms that has existed for thousands of years that we can actually get closer to and tap into. And then building on that, I think it's also about outcomes and about structural change. And so, yes, we all need to be educating ourselves. We need to be learning. There's some attitude shift that needs to happen, but the best way to change attitudes is to change behaviors. And so when I look at Jewish institutions, which is institutional life, and you know, the change is happening within institutions, and it's happening out of institutions. Mm-hmm. So there has been community for Jews of color and for people of color in the Jewish community that has been being built for many, many years, right? Outside of mainstream institutional spaces. And that will always happen. And that's amazing. And I love that. And now it's time for institutions to also do some shifting and some changing, and so that there can be some bridge between what's happening outside of institutions and what can happen inside. And I think that, you know, there is a need for, if we say, we know that, you know, over 1 million people within our community identify as, you know, either a person of color or Mizrahi or Sephardi, or, you know, many other ethnic or racial identities. But we don't see that in our leadership. We don't see that in the expressed priorities of our community. Then what's the structural shift that we can make? How can we get more of those people to the decision-making tables? And how will that structural shift then have an impact in, you know, what we see in our programming, what we see in what our kids learn about who the Jewish people are, what we see in how we prioritize the ways that we spend our resources. And I see that as a tremendous opportunity. And I think that for many organizations, this idea of, you know, engaging more diverse leaders or bringing more people into the conversation, there is this inherent challenge of how do you do that responsibly? How do you do that authentically? I think a lot of organizations and leaders are worried about this, you know, getting into this trap of tokenization, which is definitely a challenge and something that, you know, we want to avoid. And I think that it sort of comes back to our nuanced understanding of what our challenge is here, because, you know, and I like to quote, there's an Angela Davis quote that I actually love, where she says, you know, diversity is not the answer. Diversity just in and of itself is a corporate strategy. Diversity is not justice. Diversity without structural change just brings those who were formerly marginalized by either racism or misogyny, what have you, it brings those people into closer contact with the forces that were marginalizing them. And so it's not just about, oh, if we see people of color, then we're doing okay. It's also about equity. It's also about justice. And so I think in order to do that, we have to think about how are we engaging, again, diverse leaders in a relationship building, where we're inviting people in and saying all of who you are is welcome here. And by us being a multiracial community, some of our organizations might look different. Some of our traditions might look different. There might be some change here. And that's okay, because now we are co-creating. There's this idea that I think sometimes this penchant to avoid tokenism forgets that the Jews of color who we're bringing into, or are now being invited into some of these leadership spaces, they have agency. We have agency. It's not, you're not bringing me into, if you truly are, if you truly want to be my partner in this work, and now I'll have access to, the boardroom, or have access to senior leadership staff positions, that you can recognize my agency, and that it is a nuanced relationship where we're not just making transactional asks of each other, but that we are actually, doing this work, knowing how we can meet where all of our needs are prioritized altogether. And so I kind of, I think a lot about how many of the mainstream institutions that we have in the Jewish community, if we think of, when the federation system was created, or when, some of our legacy institutions were created, maybe 100 years ago, maybe 150 years ago, the people who were in the leadership positions, who were in the room when those institutions were created, did not look like me. They were mostly, I would assume, and it's probably correct, most of them were, white, straight men, cisgendered, who could not probably even imagine that I would be part of the Jewish community, let alone that there would be 1.5 million other people who might look like me who are part of the Jewish community in 2021. And so how could those people who couldn't even imagine that I would exist, how could they build an institution that would meet my needs? That's an ask. I couldn't make that ask of them, but I can't expect that they would have been able to do that looking into the future 150 years. So how do we now, knowing that, how do we be open to the possibility of what that change might need to be, both to address the needs of the people who are here right now, as well as set ourselves up to have institutions that are malleable enough so that we can go on into the future knowing that how we see ourselves or what our community looks like today might be different in 50 years and 100 years. And how can we continue to keep, pulling up a chair for those who might not be here today?
Thank you. I think it's so important to broadcast the message that we can do this and that it's going to be better for all of us. I actually think one of the things I think about when we talk about this question of so few Jews of color perhaps being in some of these institutions is that it impoverishes all the rest of us to not have the full diversity of the Jewish community in our midst, and the whole range of experiences and histories. So that's something I'm really hopeful about. So I have one last question, and before once we've talked about this question, we'll turn it over for Q&A to the audience. What can you tell us about reactions to the letter, both positive and negative, and how you might respond to them? And then as you look over the last 8 months, how do you see this conversation going forward over the next 1 or 2 or 5 years?
Yeah, when we wrote this letter and released the letter, we really felt that we were building on a movement that we had been part of for many years and had predated us, that there were other people who had been dedicated to racial justice in the Jewish community for many years. There were other Jews of color who were teachers of ours, who were activists, who had been doing this work for many years, and that we had been in relationship for many years. We believed that we had a particular message that we were articulating in our letter, and that was informed by the specific moment that we were in, and that we were capturing the momentum for people's capacity to make big change in that moment. And all of those, that movement, the moment, and the message came together in a way that allowed us to really, for that project to really resonate with a lot of people. And in some ways, I think that at that moment, there was a lot of talk. There was a lot of, of conversation in different pockets of the Jewish community. But what we saw was that were not many people who were being specific or offering a specific roadmap. And so when we put down our ideas in the Not Free to Desist letter, we were saying, here's one option. It's not the only option. It's not the only way that the Jewish community or Jewish organizations can commit to racial justice, but we're just going to give you a first stab at it. And hopefully that organizations and individuals would actually make those changes, but more importantly, that it would foster open and public conversation about this issue. And we wanted to encourage people to try new solutions and to commit to hard work of change. And we were blown away by some of the support that we got. I mean, in the first week, we had 1,800 signatories on the letter. We had, I think, 80 organizations sign on and make those commitments. And that number of signatories has increased since then. So we saw that our letter really resonated with a lot of people. And since then, I think that there's, in essence, our ask to the Jewish community was, let's commit to this challenge. Let's commit to trying, even if we don't know for sure if we'll succeed. This sort of like, let's play the game as if we can win. Let's assume that we can make the change. And I think that some of the hesitation that we saw, if there was hesitation, was that some leaders and some organizations were very hesitant to not make commitments or not show their interest in these commitments if they weren't positive that they would succeed in the end. And so we're hoping that we can kind of change the way that Jewish organizations specifically attempt these things, that actually what we can learn by trying is way more valuable than the comfort of staying where we are. I think that really what we're asking for is for the Jewish community to tap into some of that resilience, or to build some of that resilience, that this work is hard. No one has the answer. The Not Free to Desist letter is, one stab at an answer. But if the answers already existed, or we knew the time-tested formula for how to make this change, we would have done it already. So we understand that, and have some of that. We have the tolerance that this work will take dedication. It will take a commitment to discomfort. And that resilience that we can build for trying things, understanding that some of our approaches, or some of our first try at making this change won't work, but that's okay, because as long as we have the framing and the mindset that we're trying this, and if it doesn't work, this is a learning opportunity that will inform our next attempt. And I think, for many in the Jewish community, or what I've learned doing this work, is that, the Jewish community for many years thought of race, the topic of race or racial diversity, as an external conversation, that whenever you were talking about race, you were talking about those people over there, wherever they were. And this now is really a shift where we can really, embrace the fact that when we are talking about race in the Jewish community, it's actually an internal communal issue. And that is also informed by the, paradigm of race in the broader American society. It's informed by, the structures outside of the Jewish community as well. But initially, this is about justice, creating justice within our American society, and creating belonging within our community, that everyone who's part of the Jewish community really can feel that sense of belonging. And so I think that, for many, when we talk about resilience for this issue, for those that are not used to having difficult conversations about race, which often is many white people and many white Jews, that for many white people, they maybe didn't talk about race ever before 2020 because they didn't really have to, or there were certain, truths or topics that, didn't come up or you could avoid. And 2020 was sort of a shift. And I think for many people of color, we have built the resilience for difficult conversations about race because that is a survival mechanism. I've lived my entire life as a person of color within a society that is that majority, where I am a minority in many ways, and I feel the forces of marginalization in many ways. And so I've had to build that resilience for difficult conversations by necessity. And so so one of the challenges is how do you have these nuanced conversations where we're all starting at different levels and different comfort points. And so that challenge of, I can help the Jewish community build some of that resilience, but also keep our feet to the fire, so to speak, so that, I don't have to wait for you to be comfortable enough to make the change. Because if I have to wait, then what you're telling me is that that you are, comfortable with me bearing the brunt of marginalization before you are comfortable bearing the discomfort of the change. And so that is really our call to the Jewish community with this letter.
Thank you. So I think at this stage, we're just about at the point we wanted to reach in terms of time before we open it up to Q&A. So I'm going to just give some instructions to the audience before we then open it up for questions. Okay, so I'm going to start with this first question. We've learned in this series of things not to say and do when meeting new Jews of color in our congregation. Please be specific. How should we greet new Jews of color in our synagogues? And specifically, what are some things we can do to make all Jews of color feel safe and included?
Yeah, so I think that essentially, this is a question that I get asked a lot. And part of, how I think we go about, engaging in diverse community is that we all have to understand that we should all have ownership of our own stories. And so when engaging someone else or someone new, it's about creating the opportunity and the welcoming space for that person to want to share their story with you. And so I think that this is some kind of goes back to basic relationship building, so that when I'm walking into a new space, yes, you should want to connect with me, but asking, how are you Jewish? Not an appropriate way to do that, but asking someone, any question that you would ask anybody else. Great to see you. What did you think of the sermon today? Or, how long have you, or like, what's your favorite part of being here? And in starting with also offering of your own story, that, Jews of color aren't the only people who have stories to tell. How might you share information about yourself that might make it comfortable for the Jew of color that you're engaging to share information of themselves? I think that when we think about what questions we're asking Jews of color, we really need to understand and reflect if we are satisfying our own curiosity in the question we're asking, or if it's really to build a relationship. And understanding that, I think oftentimes Jews of color, when they are engaged, people ask questions in a way that is assuming that sort of like that moment is the only moment when you'll be able to learn anything about that person. And if we're truly creating a relationship, yeah, maybe you won't hear my whole story in this first meeting me, and you don't really need to know my story. But if we're building a relationship, that will go on into the future, and maybe I'll feel comfortable sharing whatever relevant parts of my story with you in the future. And I think one of the ways that we can make Jews of color feel safe and included is thinking about, specifically within our synagogues, what kind of education do we offer? When we are looking at the spate of speakers we invite into our congregation, is there racial diversity there? Are we having people, are we lifting up the voices of diverse experiences and histories? I think that when an organization, invites me to speak, even if that might be a signal to Jews of color who already are part of that organization or just live in the area, they might show up to that event because it's a topic, it's a speaker that is uniquely interesting to them. I think that recognizing that, the way that we define what is Jewish can be more expansive is also a way to make Jews of color feel included. That, when we have conversations about Black identity, that can be a Jewish conversation because there are many Jews who have Black identity. So how can we expand that notion, I think is also a great place to start.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to, let's see, I'm going to go to one here. If our congregation were to commit 20% of our endowment spending to this agenda for the next 5 years, what initiatives might we undertake that would require use of such financial resources?
So can you repeat that question?
Yes. The question was, if our congregation were to commit 20% of our endowment spending to this agenda for the next 5 years, what initiatives might we undertake that would require use of such financial resources?
Yeah, so I think that that's a great question. I think that in some ways, I would recommend, if an organization is thinking that specifically, to look at, of the 7 pillars, are there specific opportunities that seem the most relevant to your work? So I think that there's ways to invest that endowment into the leadership capacity building amongst Jews of color. So is there leadership pipelines for Jews of color in terms of learning the skills to be a lay leader, or or engaging Jews of color who are Jewish professionals in their professional development? Are there ways that you can lower the barriers to participation for Jews of color in your area, to either your congregation or Jewish camp or Jewish school? What are the ways that you can invest in new ways of thinking about and conceptualizing community safety? Is that bringing together a committee of people who can look at that? Is that about hiring people who have expertise in that way, people of color who have expertise? Is that being open to seeking out Jews of color in your area who want to create community and offering resources for that, whether that's direct financial resources or the in-kind resources that you have? How can you support their initiatives? I think that being strategic about looking at that into the future in 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, what that can look like, and building on that one by one. So yeah, we don't expect that everyone's going to make all of this change in 1 year. There's that would take a lot of skill to do within 1 year, and not every organization has access to that expertise to make that happen. But what are the changes, the small changes that you can make to build on brick by brick? How are you investing in doing a diversity audit of your organization, hiring someone that can help point out the gaps and help you understand, where you can make changes and where you can invest some of that endowment. And that, I think that's both thinking very locally as well as thinking nationally. So if you don't have Jews of color who are actively engaged within your area, how might you, one, reach out to people who are not engaged in institutional spaces around you? And then two, how might you tap into the national network of Jews of color to support that leadership, to then grow local Jew of color leadership in your area?
Okay, there's clearly a lot of ideas in there. So we have a number of questions on here. Some of them are a little more on topic than others. So I'm going to pick one here that I think is, particularly interesting. Does a conservative/traditional synagogue need to redefine its brand to embrace this work?
So, I mean, without knowing what exactly is meant by its brand, I'm a little. I will answer the question, but I'm not sure if what I'm thinking
So
of
I guess
is...
I'll try to clarify a little bit. I think I know where the questioner is coming from here. A traditional, we'll call it mainstream synagogue in the suburbs, predominantly white, that has a certain reputation in the community in terms of being fairly traditional. And the question is whether that becomes appealing to the community whom we're trying to engage with. And if not, does that mean that you would need to redefine how you present yourself or what you say is your brand?
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I think that part of there are a number of challenges here in this scenario, right? So doing work within religious movements, there are certain ways that we define Jewish community in different areas of the Jewish community that is going to either help or hinder this idea of how do we engage more diverse audiences. So there's unique challenges. So conservative traditional synagogue, I'm immediately thinking of some of the work that my organization Lashon has done with conservative day schools, right? And they're thinking about how can we reach more diverse families. Well, if there is a certain standard of how, or definition of how we define Jewish and Jewish families, that is going to hinder us from working with or engaging interfaith families, that might limit how much diversity or how many diverse families we're able to engage. So that is, I think, an inherent challenge that can sometimes be involved in sort of like synagogue or religious denominational attempts at this. That being said, I think that there's also a broader approach to thinking about what are the ways that marginalization of people of color, both directly within the Jewish community, has impeded the engagement of diverse audiences, and then what are the forces of marginalization outside of the Jewish community that has created barriers to engaging a diverse audience. And I can give you an example of what I mean. So I think that one of the internal issues or challenges that we have is, one, our communities, the way that we have talked about Jewish identity in the past, where we might have assumed that everyone in our community is white, or everyone comes from, had parents or grandparents who came from Eastern Europe. That consciousness, or how we defined our identity, both implicitly and explicitly, had a negative impact on marginalizing Jews who didn't fit that mold. And so that might have perpetuated who is showing up in that Jewish space, because some people just didn't feel like they were included in that narrative. That has also pushed some, there are narratives you can read of people who, it's an age-old immigration question also, that the the older immigrants who come and establish themselves and make their way, sometimes marginalize the newer immigrants. So whether that's, Sephardic or Mizrahi immigrants who came in the last century who had a hard time integrating into the largely Ashkenazi or even German Jewish institutional spaces. So how did that happen, and how did that inform who's engaged? And then also, if we think of the broader impacts of racism on our society and how that might create barriers to engaging a diverse audience, for synagogues especially, if you think of geography as a big barrier for engaging people, if housing discrimination has impacted who lives where within your city and where your synagogue is physically located, that's
welcome to Baltimore.
Right, Baltimore, Atlanta, New York. That's a reality that is part of the challenge of now. Okay, where are many Black Jewish people living? Probably where other Black people live. And if your Jewish synagogue is located in a place that is very far from racially mixed neighborhoods, how is that going to create another barrier for you? So, how do we get creative in how we overcome that? Also, what is the role of that synagogue or your community, your congregation, in addressing some of those issues on a broader scale? So I think that in terms of branding, I think that there's work that can be done to creating authentically multiracial community. And then there's also work that can be done, if we're saying, yes, we are a predominantly, if we first need to be honest about where we are. So if you are a predominantly white institution, what does that mean? And what is the work you can do to address the impact of racial marginalization that you can do, whether or not a person of color is in the room at that moment? There's lots of work you can do before you're actually even engaging people of color.
Thank you. So I'm going to just check in with Trillian. We have a few more questions. Do we have time to ask a couple more, or we don't have a hard stop? It's 5 right now, do we?
You can push it maybe 1, maybe 2 more questions.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Well, this is a kind of a big question. I don't know if you can answer this. So if you feel it's too big to answer here, then maybe we can take it offline. What specific things can be done to get rid of discrimination in the Jewish community? That's a huge question. I'm not quite sure.
It's a huge question. And I'm available for hire to answer that question. But I mean, seriously, that kind of question, I love that people are thinking that way. And I think one of the ways that we can address discrimination or bias in the Jewish community is, again, like, there's a lot of people of color and Jews of color who are focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So how do we give more platforms to those people to speak, to, again, be like in the halls of power, to be in at the table in some of the decision-making processes? That is one step. I think that there's both the education. So if we think about what are the knowledge, the skills, and the attitudes as individuals that are going to help us be able to engage in some of this racial justice change work. So what's the knowledge you need? Do you have a background of understanding the context of race and racism in the United States? Do you have that historical understanding of how many European Jews have been able to assimilate into whiteness, and what is the impact of whiteness on our community and the success that the Jewish community has had by and large, and how the Jewish community fits in within an American context? Do you have skills like empathy? Do you have skills like adaptive leadership that are going to help us make some of this change? How can you invest in some of those skills? How can you recognize your own bias? That's a really hard thing to break down, how to recognize bias on an individual level. It's also a skill. How do you recognize the existence of bias within an institution and within a structure? part of that is by looking at outcomes. If we know that 20% of the Jewish community is racially or ethnically diverse, and we look at our leadership of the Jewish community, and that's probably less than 1% racially or ethnically diverse, that is an expression of bias. So what can we do about that in making that structural change? And then the attitudes, are we committed to change? Are we committed to learning? Do we recognize our own, are we engaged in ways to develop our own self-awareness of who am I, what is my story, and where am I situated within the structures and the structures of society, and what role can I play? So that's both that individual education as well as the institutional movement. So how do we, again, make this conversation an ongoing conversation? I mean, I think that there has been some shift and change that has happened. I mean, we've seen a shift. I would say that the shift in the Jewish community in talking about race has somewhat paralleled the shift in the broader American society. We saw a little bit of shift post 2014 and Ferguson and Black Lives Matter. We also saw a shift post the election in 2016, and now 2020 really reflecting that. And so how can we commit to making sure that this is a lasting shift, that the Jewish community can sustain its capacity to focus on this, that it's not just a question of what do we do about racial justice in 2021, but how do we make that commitment to racial justice part of our ongoing priority for who we are as a community.
Okay, so this has really been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you being here. Trillian, I think you want to take us through the end.
Yes, just very quickly. So I'm Trillian Atwood with the Jewish Museum of Maryland. I just wanted to say thank you to those of you in the audience for joining us this afternoon and through the series as a whole. I want to say a massive, massive thank you to Andy and Lindsey for just guiding us through such an amazing conversation. Thank you so much. Just quickly, a note to those in the audience: when you leave today, you'll be directed to a survey. Please take a moment to complete it, as it really does help us to serve you better. Before you go, my colleagues are now adding some links to the chat, and we'll make sure we stay online just for a moment so you can grab both those links and any of the links from earlier in the program. Just to confirm, the links you're going to see there are links from a link to see the recordings of all of the past programs in the series. There's also links to all of the partner institutions in this series, so the Jewish Museum of Maryland, Hizar Kamuna, and the Reginald F. Lewis Museum. And then there is also a link there to Lashon, the organization where Lindsey is based. And then just finally, I'd like to take a moment to thank those that have been behind the success of this series. Of course, our partners, Hizar Kamuna and the Reginald F. Lewis Museum, all of the featured speakers and moderators who've joined us for the series and all of the prep that went into it. And finally, I'd like to say thank you to those who planned and delivered the series: Tracy Guy-Decker, Dr. Harriet Wims, Andy Miller, Melissa Halpin, Rachel Kassman, Laura Grant, and Abe Kronsberg, who... Massive thank you to Abe. Not only did he drive the development of the entire series, but with his wife, Robin Captain, they funded the series. And so a thank you to you guys especially. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening, and I hope that we see you all again very soon. Thank you very much. Thanks. Goodbye.